Hi everybody, I just want to talk a little bit today about the Chanukah story, and Chanukah is coming up, and people debate, is Chanukah an important holiday or an unimportant holiday? Some people say, in the secular culture, people like to build up Chanukah because that way Jewish people feel they have an important holiday when Christmas comes along, so they're equal. Other people say, oh no, Chanukah is not a Yom Tov. Chanukah, is not like Pesach. It's not like Rosh Hashanah. It's not that important. The truth of the matter is, though, Chanukah is not a Yom Tov in the sense that, you can do work and everything else. But Chanukah is a very, very important holiday. And it has some very extreme, vital lessons for us as Jews. We know the basic story of Chanukah. By the way, the date, just to give you the sense of the dates, the Chanukah story occurred around 180 BCE, before the Common Era. Now, this is during the era of the Second Temple. Okay, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. There was a 70-year exile. We then built a second temple after 70 years. Many Jews returned to the land of Israel. Many Jews didn't. And we built the second temple. And initially, we built the second temple. We were under the rule of Persia. That's King Cyrus, King Ahasuerus. But the Persian Empire was defeated by Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who established within Eretz Yisrael what you might call part of the Greek Empire. Although Alexander was not Greek, he was Macedonian, but his culture was Greek culture. Alexander the Great ruled over most of the known world. He ruled over all of Europe, most of Asia, all the way to India. He didn't get to Americas then, but he got to all of the known world. Well, in fact, legend has it. By the way, there's an interesting little story the Gemara tells us. Or Sameach, of course, is located on Shimon HaTzadik Street. Shimon the Tzaddik, Shimon the Righteous. Who was Shimon HaTzadik? He was a high priest during the Second Temple period, and he was a high priest during Alexander the Great's reign over the whole Greek Empire. And at one point, Alexander was very tolerant. He allowed all the different religions to flourish. Alexander was not anti-Semitic. Jews could be Jews and pagans could be pagans. But at some point, somebody convinced him that the Jews were trying to revolt against him. So he was determined to destroy the temple and destroy Jerusalem. So Shimon HaTzadik was chosen to go to Alexander, appease him, and beg him to spare Yerushalayim and the temple. So the story goes, the Gemara says in Yuma, that Shimon HaTzadik came out to talk to Alexander, and when Alexander saw Shimon HaTzadik, he got off his horse, and he bowed down to the ground, and he said, "You are the person that I see in all of my dreams telling me, do not dare to destroy the temple. I thought these were just dreams. I paid no attention. But now I see that God sent your spirit to me to warn me." And because of this, Alexander spared the temple. He spared Jerusalem. And the Gemara records that in commemoration of this great event, every Jewish child that was born during that year was given the name Alexander. And that is why Alexander is actually considered to be a Jewish name. It's of Greek origin, but it's entered the Jewish names, and a person could be called up to the Torah. If your name is Alexander, you can be called up to the Torah, Alexander ben Moshe, or whatever it is. And that dates from the time of Shimon HaTzadik. Okay, so that was Alexander. When Alexander the Great died, and he died as a very young man. In fact, the story goes, he was only in his 30s. And he died, he contracted the malaria in Africa, but he died, they say, he had a broken heart because he was crying. He said, "There are no more worlds for me to conquer. I conquered the whole world." Of course, Alexander only saw the physical world. He didn't realize that there's an infinity of spiritual worlds that there always is to conquer. And the most difficult conquest is the spiritual world within yourself. It's a lot easier to conquer the worlds out there than it is to conquer the world within you. But okay, be it as it may. When Alexander died, though, the empire was so big that it was split among different generals who took over different empires. And there were actually 4 different generals who took different parts of his empire. But for Jewish history purposes, there's only 2 that are significant. Seleucus took Syria and Turkey, And Ptolemy, that's Ptolmey, Ptolemy, we don't pronounce the P, took Egypt. Now, if you have a picture of the map of the Middle East in your mind, you can understand that the land of Israel is right between those two segments. The Seleucus Empire is Syria and Turkey, and the Ptolemaic Empire is Egypt and North Africa. Eretz Yisrael, for around 100 years, was a political football between those two segments. Sometime, in other words, the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucus Empire were constantly fighting each other. And often, the country that was at stake was who got control of Eretz Yisrael. Sometimes Eretz Yisrael was under the Ptolemaic influence, and sometimes it was under the Seleucus influence. Under the Ptolemaic influence, I'll just tell you one story about that. That was the initial. Eretz Yisrael was initially under the control of the Egyptian branch of Alexander's empire. And that was the famous story in which they wanted to translate the Torah into Greek. So Ptolemy, actually, which Ptolemy? There are many Ptolemies. All the kings were called Ptolemy, like Pharaoh. But one of the Ptolemies took 70 Jewish elders, and he put them in separate rooms, and he told them, translate the Torah into the Greek language. And miraculously, they all came up with the exact translation, which shows that God gave them divine spirit to translate everything exactly. They even deviated when something would have been insulting. For example, one of the non-kosher animals is arnevis, which means rabbit. But apparently the Greek word for rabbit, whatever it was Ptolemy's wife. So if they would have said, so-and-so rabbit is treif, is no good, repulsive, that would have hurt the wife. So they changed it to some other, like hare instead of rabbit, whatever the Greek words would be. Now you might think that this is an occasion of great rejoicing, Baruch Hashem, that these 70 elders had prophecy. But the Gemara actually tells us, the day that this translation was completed, darkness and sadness came to the world, because God did not want the Torah to be translated. God did not want the nations of the world to be able to distort the Torah, which they could once there's a translation. And of course, God did not want his own people to read the Torah in translation. Now, I mean, Baruch Hashem, we have translations because we need them, but everyone understands that that's not perfect. That's not the way things should be in the ideal world. So that's why there's sadness. It's not that it wasn't a good idea, but even if something is a good idea, we can be sad that it was necessary to have that idea, that the Torah was translated into classical Greek. This is called the Septuagint. Maybe you've heard of the Septuagint, which literally just means the translation of the 70, because there were 70 elders. In scholarly literature, in academic literature, it is referred to as the LXX, which is simply the Roman numeral for 70. L, X, and X, right? So a scholarly site to the Septuagint would say, in LXX we read so-and-so. That's what happened in the Ptolemy. But as I say, Eretz Yisrael is a football going back and forth. The Chanukah story occurred after one of the skirmishes where the Seleucid Empire conquered the land of Israel from the Ptolemaic Empire. And the king who conquered was Antiochus, not the Antiochus of Chanukah, the predecessor, because there are a number of these kings, Antiochus the first. And, in some ways, the Jews really didn't care if they were under Ptolemy or Seleucus. Both were oppressive. What's the difference, But basically, eventually, as the Seleucus kings came and died, a king arose who was called Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes literally means Antiochus the Great. This was a title he gave himself. But his own subjects changed the title a little bit. Instead of calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, they changed it to Antiochus Epimanes. Instead of PH, they put in an M. And Antiochus Epimanes means Antiochus the Crazy. And this had nothing to do with the Jews. This is his own subjects considered him to be paranoid. They probably didn't have the psychological terminology, but they considered him to be the equivalent of paranoid schizophrenic. And he was a power-hungry person. But you have to understand, so he was not specifically only against the Jews. He was against all sorts of people. But the Jews were in his cross-eyed target as well. But here is Antiochus' philosophy, and this is a very interesting philosophy, because on some level, you could look at Antiochus as almost an enlightened civil libertarian. Antiochus was not Hitler. Antiochus was not Haman. Haman wanted to kill Jews physically, no matter how non-religious. Haman didn't care if you were religious or non-religious. And Hitler didn't care if you were religious or non-religious. He just wanted to physically kill Jews. In that way, Antiochus was not an anti-Semite. But Antiochus' agenda was this. He wanted to consolidate his empire. And he thought, in order to have a strong empire, there needed to be homogenization of culture. People should have the same customs, the same practices. They should dress the same. They should glorify a common Greek civilization, a civilization that was very, very prominent in art, in literature, both comedies and tragedies. Right? The first plays come from Greece. In philosophy, in mathematics, in science, in architecture, and even in athletics, the Olympic Games and the like. And Antiochus felt that this was a beautiful culture, and it was necessary that everybody should be participants in that culture. Problem was, those Jews were just not assimilating. They had circumcision, which meant in the athletic games, you could always, which was were naked in the Greek culture, you could tell who was a Jew. And why do you have to do that? You have to be different. In terms of eating, they look down at us. They don't even eat at our table. In terms of religion, now you have to understand, the ancient Greeks were not really a religious people. The idolatry was simply almost like a social convention. If you were a respectable Greek, of course, you went to Jupiter, Zeus, and you brought sacrifices. It wasn't like people were yearning. No Greek said, I yearn to have a relationship with Zeus. First of all, these Greek gods were disgusting entities anyway. Zeus raped and pillaged and murdered. And the Greek gods were essentially dysfunctional human beings with superpowers. They were not, even within the Greek religion, they were not sources of morality or goodness or anything else. And if anything, the whole concept of religion was bribe them so they stay out of my way. I just don't want Zeus to rape my wife, so I'll bring him a sacrifice or something so he'll stay away from my wife and kids. That's all it was. They were never a source of anything good. The best thing that could happen is they stayed out of your life and they wouldn't bother you, and then Baruch Hashem, you're okay. And that was it. So religion was not a positive force in life. So Antiochus was not like a religious fanatic. You got to believe in my idols. But his point was that because the Jews were so different, they were so distinct, they were not mixing into the empire. They were not assimilating. They were not becoming part of the culture. And Antiochus wanted there to be a common culture. Now, Alexander also wanted Greek culture, but Alexander was benign in the sense that he wanted people to become assimilated by being persuaded. Antiochus, because of his paranoid schizophrenic inclination, wanted to force people to obey this culture. And as a result, he promulgated a number of decrees against religion, prohibiting Jews upon pain of death to practice circumcision. They were not allowed to declare the Jewish calendar of the holiday cycles based on Rosh Chodesh and the like. They were not allowed to publicly keep Shabbos, although privately, how could you stop that? And they were not allowed to keep the kosher laws publicly. Again, what people did privately, a lot of this you obviously could not control. And the intention was cultural assimilation. Now, the thing you have to know about this is that this did not start off as a war. Antiochus did not, first of all, he didn't have to wage war. He was already the ruler of Eretz Yisrael by virtue of his defeat of Ptolemaic. So Eretz Yisrael is under his control, political control, and he did not want to kill Jews directly, but he wanted there to be assimilation. He wanted Jews to abandon their distinctive beliefs. Now, the one thing you need to know is that many, 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 many Jews went along with his agenda. In fact, many Jews had adopted Greek culture even before Antiochus' decrees, all the way back from Alexander the Great. There was rampant intermarriage. Many Jews were not keeping kosher. Many Jews were following the Greek philosophies and Greek literature. This is what we mean by calling them Hellenists. Right? Hellas is the ancient word for Greek, and Hellenistic culture is the Greek philosophy, literature, art, the glorification of the body, but also the mind. I mean, we're not going to say Greeks were not brutes. I mean, had mathematics and art and science. Archimedes, Euclid, Aristotle was the greatest philosopher of the ancient world outside of Judaism itself. And we know later the Rambam himself, Maimonides, very much uses Aristotle in the development of his own philosophy. I know that some of you guys are learning the Kuzri. The Kuzri indeed rejected Aristotle totally, but the Rambam did not. The Rambam uses Aristotle in many, many positive ways. So you have to know that the Chanukah story did not occur with a totally religious Jewish nation against Antiochus. Many, many Jews went along with Antiochus. They weren't in favor of the coercion, but they didn't need coercion. They were Hellenists before Antiochus came on the scene. And they were doing well, because you have to understand, assimilation had a benefit. Antiochus, you could even say, the ACLU might have liked Antiochus. He was a civil libertarian. Jews had full political rights, social rights, economic rights. They could participate in society. They could vote for whatever, local elections and the like. So assimilation was pretty good if you didn't mind giving up Torah and connection to God. There was only a small group of fanatical Jews who said, we're not giving up anything. Our relationship to God is so important that we will even give up our lives if necessary. And remember, there were a small group of Jews. Remember, the Jews of the Chanukah story are not only fighting against the Greeks, they're fighting against their fellow Jews. Maybe not in war. They didn't wage war against their fellow Jews. But they were regarded as fanatics, obstructionists. The way people talk about sometimes the Haredi Jews in Israel today, just fanatics. And it started off with one family. And this family goes by two names. And it's interesting to know, we don't know which is the family name, which isn't. They are called the Hashmonaim, and they are called the Maccabees. Now, what is the origin of these? They are more or less interchangeable. But the Hashmonaim was a family of Kohanim, of priests. Why are they called Hashmonaim? We don't know exactly, but probably because there was a town in the Judean hills called Hashmona, and the family's origin is from that town. So Hashmonaim, Hasmoneans in English, but Hashmonaim. Now Maccabee also has two different origins. Maccabee was the name that this family gave to their army. So technically it's a little different. The Hashmonaim is the family of priests, and the Maccabim is the army that they created. Initially a very small group, but the group began to grow bigger and bigger. Hashmonaim, as I say, is a place. So that's just where they came from. Maccabim, two interpretations, and it depends how you spell it. See, the reason why we don't know how they spelt Maccabee. Why don't we know? Because the earliest records we have about the Maccabees are written in Greek. So we see the word Maccabee, but we don't know how they spelt it in Hebrew. And that is why we have a machlokas. Some say Maccabee is an abbreviation that appeared on their banner. When they went to war, there were 4 letters on their flag. Mem, Chaf, Beis, Yud. And that stands for the pasuk, Mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem. Who is as mighty as you, God, among all the other forces in the world? Mem chaf beis yud. Mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem. However, there is another interpretation that Maccabee is spelled with a kuf instead of a kaf. Mem kuf beis yud. And that means a hammer. Makebet means a hammer. And it just refers to the fact that it was such a powerful army that they were like a hammer blow against the enemy. So if we had the original Hebrew of the Maccabee flag, we would be able to know which one is right. But since we only know the word Maccabee from the Greek, the Gemara doesn't even mention the term Maccabee. So we're not sure if it's a chaf or a kuf, and therefore we're not sure what the meaning is. Now, the head of this clan was a very old Kohen Gadol, whose name was Matisyahu. Matisyahu was not a military man, he was too old to be involved. But Matisyahu was the one that said, we have to come together, we have to be willing to die for Hashem. We have to understand that we cannot give up the Torah. Without the Torah, we're nothing. Without Hashem, we're nothing. And all of the wealth and all of the culture and all of the glamour that this society promises us is not worth it if we give up our soul and we give up our neshama. And Matisyahu died very soon after, but he had 5 sons. And these 5 sons became the leaders of this revolt against Antiochus. The most famous in terms of military prowess is Yehuda the Maccabee, but there was Elazar, there was Shimon, there was Yochanan, right? There were the whole group of the Maccabees. And originally they were just very small, and they started what you call guerrilla warfare, meaning to say you had the big Greek-Syrian armies, and you had these small groups of people hiding out in the caves and the mountains, and they would ambush. So I want to point out, Antiochus did not declare war against the Jews. Antiochus promulgated these decrees. The Maccabees actually were the ones that started to attack the Syrians, called Syrian Greeks, because they're stationed from Syria. And they did so with the intention of liberating Eretz Yisrael from the rule of Antiochus, but not for political reasons, but liberating Eretz Yisrael from the rule of Antiochus in order to reestablish the ability to keep the Torah. Now, we have our Tanakh. Our Tanakh are our holy books, but there are certain books which are not part of the Bible. They're excluded from the Bible because they don't have holiness, but they are still historical chronicles. And this is called the Apocrypha. And one of the books of the Apocrypha is called the Book of the Maccabees. And the Book of the Maccabees, there are 4 books of the Maccabees. Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2, Maccabees 3, Maccabees 4. But the main historical one is Maccabees 1. And the Book of the Maccabees actually gives you the story of Chanukah as a historical event. But what's important to know is, and you wouldn't know this from the Gemara itself, is that the war against Antiochus lasted for around 25 years. This was not like a little, war and then we had Chanukah. This was a 25-year struggle till the land of Israel was liberated. And the story of Chanukah is part of that struggle. It's not the whole struggle. The struggle started, of course, before the Chanukah story, and it continued after. Chanukah was not the end. Chanukah is towards the beginning. Let me explain what happened. I'll first give you the sliver that's Chanukah, and then we'll talk about the rest of the story. And it's interesting, Chazal did not really care that much about the rest of the story, and then I'll describe why that's so as well. They only cared, in other words, you have this 25-year struggle. Chazal pulled out a 3-year slice of it, and they made a holiday about that, and they ignored everything else. And I'll explain why. I'll tell you what that story was, and then I'll explain why Chazal later ignored it. In the middle of this skirmish, this little guerrilla war, in which sometimes Jews were killed and sometimes the Yevanim were killed, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And if you're a military history buff, which again, Chazal were not so interested in details, in the Book of the Maccabees, we're given battle by battle by battle by battle description. Again, for many of you, for me, for example, that's pretty boring stuff. But, if you're a West Point guy or whatever it is, you'll like to know strategies and guerrilla warfare and all sorts of things, lessons that could still be useful even today. But in the middle of this guerrilla warfare, the Yevanim achieved a massive victory. They gained control of the temple. Now that was an awesome tragedy for the Jewish people. They gained control of the Beis HaMikdash. Jews were still living in Jerusalem, but the Yevanim gained control of the temple. And what they did to the temple, they didn't destroy it. They did not destroy the temple, but they profaned it. They built altars for idolatry. They erected statues of the Greek gods. They set up houses of sacred prostitution. Do you know that one of the Greek rituals were to have actually religious prostitution? Imagine, in the holiest place in the world, they desecrated, contaminated. And of course, they did not allow Jews to enter to do their own service, obviously. And this was Antiochus' final defiance of the Jewish people. You think your God is going to protect you? Look what I do. I go into the house of your God. And I put up my gods and my sacrifices and my prostitutes. And what are you going to do about it? He thought this would crush and break. You understand, this is really psychological warfare in many ways. Because what is a Jew supposed to feel when their own temple? In fact, this was psychologically much more devastating than maybe even destruction. Had there been destruction of that, so there's no temple. Here they're taking the temple and they're desecrating it. And they held on to that temple for 3 years. 3 years. Interestingly enough, the day they entered the temple was the 25th of Kislev. In other words, the day that became Chanukah was the day that the Greeks entered the temple. And they held it for 3 years. Amidst battles, skirmishes, the Jews could not rout them. But finally, 3 years later, to the day, on the 25th of Kislev, around 180, around the 180s, 182, it's one of those dates, in the early 180s. This is BCE, 180 BCE. The Maccabees gained control of the Beis HaMikdash. Can you imagine what a joy that was? They gained control of the Beis HaMikdash. But the Beis HaMikdash needed to be purified. You needed to remove the prostitution. You needed to remove the idolatry. They needed to purify the temple. And it was filled with rubble and it was, all sorts of state of disarray. And that is when they looked for some oil that had not been contaminated. And they found only one little jar of oil, enough to last for 1 day. And it would take 8 days till they could get new oil. But they lit the oil of the menorah. Right in the menorah, the temple had a menorah to be lit every day. This is in the Torah. So, in other words, we don't light the menorah in the temple because of Chanukah. We light the menorah in the temple because the Torah says you light the menorah in the temple. But they only had 1 day of oil. They lit it. It miraculously burned for 8 days. Now, here is the story. Did Chanukah end the war against the Greeks? It did not. Chanukah represented the recapturing of the temple and the rededication of the temple and the miracle of the oil. But the actual war against the Greeks went on for around 20 more years. So Chanukah is not the end of a struggle. Chanukah is towards the beginning of the struggle. Now, why was it so significant? Because it gave the beleaguered Jews a message of hope. Because think about this in this way. What did that candle represent to that generation? They're fighting against odds that are almost impossible. The Greek army of Antiochus is the most powerful in the world. This is the successor of Alexander the Great. These Jews are a little band of non-professional soldiers. And not only are they vastly outnumbered by the tremendous armies of the Greeks, but their own people think they're crazy. They're not supported by most of the Jewish people. And after a while, you give up. You think, what's the use of fighting? If we want to keep the Torah, listen, we'll go to the caves and keep the Torah. But we have no chance of displacing. How can the small, the few, defeat the many? So what is the lesson of the Chanukah story? That light, which should only have enough oil for 1 day, burns beyond its capacity. So Hashem is telling the Jewish people, you think you're powerless. You think you're helpless. You think you can't make a difference. But look at this oil. This oil also shouldn't have been able to burn more than 1 day. But it was able to do so. Have hope. I think there's something very beautiful about the fact. See, most people, when they think about the story, they think Chanukah was the end of the war. I think there's something very beautiful in Hashem giving the message in the beginning of the war. Because Hashem's message is, don't give up. Keep on going. With my blessing, nothing is going to be impossible. And that gave them the courage to keep on going. So, Chanukah celebrates a few things. It celebrates recapturing the temple. It celebrates rededicating the temple. That's the word Chanukah. Chanukah actually means rededication. And it celebrates Hashem's message of hope via the miracle of the oil that should have only burnt one day, and it burnt 8 days. But what it didn't do is, it didn't end the struggle. The struggle went on for almost 2 decades, maybe 2 decades. And then at the end of that struggle, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, acquired independence. The Jewish state became an independent state. And they established their own kingdom, the kingdom of the Hashmonaim. Now, as I indicated, Chazal only made Chanukah a holiday. For example, if we were deciding what should be a holiday, maybe the independence of the Jewish state ought to be the holiday. Yom Ha'atzmaut of the ancient world. Chazal did not even, I don't even know the date myself, although it's in the book of the Maccabees, when Shimon was, a lot of the Maccabee brothers died, but Shimon was the one who became the first king, the Hasmonean king. The book of the Maccabees gives us a date, and yet that's not a holiday. So you see from here that we don't make holidays just to celebrate political independence. And there's another thing too, you might remember from high school, George Orwell's book, Animal Farm. I have to be careful not to say Animal House, that's something else, okay? Okay. Yeah. I once embarrassed myself, so I was saying, okay, but anyway. But Animal Farm is a parody of the Russian Revolution. And what happened in the Russian Revolution? In Animal Farm, what happened was that the animals are revolting against the oppressive owners. But what happens is that some of the animals become just as bad. And that was the Russian Revolution. You want to overthrow the Tsar? And what do? You get Lenin and Stalin. Is that really much of an improvement? You want to overthrow Louis XV? You get Robespierre. You want to overthrow whatever the government in Cambodia was? You get Pol Pot. You overthrow the Chinese dictatorships? You get Mao Zedong. You overthrow Batista in Cuba? We get the benign leadership of Fidel Castro. Again, the United States might be an exception to this. Actually, Eretz Yisrael also is, 1948. But often, the history of revolutions are that the revolutionary government becomes just as oppressive, if not more so, than the very thing they threw out. This is the tragedy of the Hasmoneans. The original Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, they were tzaddikim, they were kedoshim. Their fight was to establish Torah and God and keeping the mitzvahs. But do you know that their successors, the monarchy they established, eventually became the very enemy that they tried to vanquish? They became Hellenists. They became proponents of Greek culture. They became persecutors of the sages. King Yanai, if you know, the Hasmonean monarchy lasted for around 100 years until the Romans came in. And then the Romans conquered it and they were gone. So Chazal, in retrospect, said, what are we supposed to celebrate here? We're supposed to celebrate the establishment of the Hasmonean kingdom? What for? The Hasmonean kingdom became the Hellenists that they supplanted. So they got rid of one group of Hellenists, they became Hellenists, and they became Jewish Hellenists, which is even worse than non-Jewish Hellenists. So as a result, Chazal ignored the 25 years and the monarchy of the Hellenists. They just focused on the regaining of the temple and the pure spiritual light. Okay? So there is a lot more to the history of Chanukah than we celebrate. But Chazal saw spiritually, it is only that segment that is special and unique and holy. Because Chanukah is not about political liberation. It is not about independence for the sake of independence. It is about freedom in order to serve Hashem. It is about the light of Torah, the light of holiness, the light of getting back the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? And this is why we celebrate Chanukah primarily by commemorating the miracle of the oil rather than emphasizing the military victories, because the military victories themselves were not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was the connection to Hashem, and of course, the light of a candle is symbolic of the light of Torah, the light of holiness, and the like. So one of the interesting ironies of history, Israel has kind of an Olympic-type game called the Maccabee Games, called Maccabean Games or Maccabee Games. So it's kind of a paradox. Again, I'm not critical of sports. We need sports. That's fine. But it's interesting they use the name of the Maccabees. I mean, because the very thing the Maccabees were fighting against were the Greek Olympic Games and the like. So what we do is we take the Maccabees' name and we attach it to something which was one of the very things they were fighting against. That's a final indignity. So we ought to attach Maccabee Games to our Thursday night Mishmar, right? We should say we're having a Maccabee Mishmar, tonight and the like, because that's what the Maccabees really cared about in that sense. Okay, so in the book of the Maccabees, just to give you a sense, that story of Chanukah is only like 1/5 of the book, and 4/5 of the book are all the battles that happened after that point. But from the perspective of our sages, we don't really care about the rest of that stuff, because that did not establish the holiness of the Torah, and that did not perpetuate the Jewish community. I'm sorry, someone had a hand up? Yeah. Oh,
I was just going to ask, so that seems to be like a common thing, that like something that was once holy, like we take the word and we put it to something else, like luach, like the luchot, where
that's right.
Not
that's
to
right.
erase, and we use a blackboard and we call it luach.
Yep.
Which you can't erase everything.
Yep. I'll give you another example. That's a very good point. What is the Hebrew word for electricity? Everyone knows that, right? What's the Hebrew word?
Chashmal.
Chashmal. Okay. Where do you get chashmal? So if you because remember, Eliezer ben Yehuda, not a religious person, but Eliezer ben Yehuda is kind of the inventor of Hebrew as a modern spoken language. He came from Russia. His name was Eliezer Perlman. He took on the name Eliezer ben Yehuda. The Ben Yehuda Street is named after Eliezer ben Yehuda. Which actually makes sense in that sense, and he had to coin a lot of words. He had to invent a lot of words. But what did he do? He went back to the Bible, to the Tanakh, and to the Talmud, and he would try to take words and adapt them to modern scenarios. So Chashmal appears in the book of Yecheskel. In the book of Yecheskel, Ezekiel, he has an image of God's divine throne. The Kisei HaKavod, God's divinity. And it's surrounded with a bright luminescence, a radiance of light. And that radiance of light is called Chashmal. So Chashmal is the radiant light that surrounds the Shekhinah on the throne of glory. The holiest light. Eliezer ben Yehuda said, that sounds like electricity. Okay. Okay. So as a result, what is the chashmal, the light of the Shekhinah, now becomes that. That is why there are some people, even to this very day, they will not use the word chashmal. They say it's a sacred word. They will write out in Hebrew letters, electric. Ayin Lamed. They will spell out electric. They will not use, which after all, in Hebrew, half of modern Hebrew is English anyway. What's the Hebrew word for telephone? Telephone. Television. So they say, I'll do electric. I don't have to use chashmal. So some people say it's a big chilul Hashem to use chashmal for electricity. I say, most of us do it. I do it myself, but it is something to think about, that you're really profaning a word and you're putting it down the way. Let me just end with one very quickie question. There's a very, very famous question about Chanukah, one of the most famous questions, and I'm sure your rabbis have discussed it. That is, hey, what's the miracle? They needed oil for 8 days, because they couldn't have new oil until 8 days passed in terms of the time that it would take. And they only found enough oil for 1 day. And a miracle happened, that the oil that should have burnt only 1 day burnt 8 days. So if we ask ourselves, what's the miracle? The miracle is it burned 7 days longer than it should have. Well, so the question is, why is Chanukah 8 days? It ought to be 7 days. The first day was not a miracle. There's enough oil for the first day. So why do you celebrate Chanukah? So one answer is very simple. Based on the history that I just showed you, you can give the following answer. Day 1 of Chanukah is not a holiday because of the miracle of the oil. It's because that's the day we regained the temple. So it's like two celebrations. The first day is, Baruch Hashem, we have the temple. And the other days is the miracle of the oil, right? You can actually split it that way. That would be a simple answer. But there are other answers too. Some say that even on the first day there was a miracle, because the way the miracle worked was they poured the jar of oil into the menorah, and then the jar filled up again. So it's not like we think that that oil just burned straight. Rather, every day that they emptied it, they had another jar that they used for the next day. So even on day 1, there was a miracle that the oil filled up as soon as they emptied it. There are actually 500 answers to this question. Now, I know that because I've seen Svarim that give you 500 answers. So I don't know the 500 answers, but I know there are 500 answers. But let me give you a beautiful answer that I think is very meaningful. And that is that sometimes the reason God does miracles for us is to make us realize that everyday life is also a miracle. But we take it for granted because, every day I breathe, every day I walk, I don't look at it like a miracle. So every once in a while, God hits us with a real miracle to make us realize how much he does for us all the time. So maybe in some ways, the miracle of the 7 days, which is supernatural, is designed to make us focus that even the ordinary burning of oil is also a miracle. What do we say? We're going to say in davening, Al nisecha shebachol yom imanu. I thank God for the miracles that are with us every single day. That a Jew has to recognize my ability to breathe, my ability to walk, my ability to learn. All of that is a miracle. It's a gift from God. And of course, we think about Eretz Yisrael, that in spite of all of the tragedies and all the difficulties, that you can be in Yerushalayim, that the Jewish people can be in this country. Tremendous miracle. Rav Yaakov Emden writes that people say, if only God would do miracles like the olden days. God would do the 10 plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea. Then I would believe in God. But God doesn't do that stuff anymore. Rav Yaakov Emden writes that the survival of the Jewish people after all the enemies that tried to destroy us is a bigger miracle than the splitting of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues. God does miracles that are even greater than those miracles. But, we don't appreciate it. So Chanukah does mean dedication of the temple, but it also means dedication of the soul. So I hope that the light of Chanukah should bring the light of Hashem into our heart, into our soul, that we should dedicate ourselves as a temple for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you all take care. Happy Chanukah.